In today's video, I'm going to take a look at one of Batman's oldest and most well-known foes, the Catwoman. She's arguably one of Batman's most recognisable villains. Although not really quite a villain, but definitely not a hero, but at least most of the time. Delving into her comic book origins, Catwoman made her debut in April 1940's Batman #1, which was released just about a year after Batman's very first appearance in Detective Comics 27. This comic is also notable for containing the first appearance of the Joker. In the golden age of comics, it was very common for comic books to contain multiple short stories rather than a single lengthier adventure, and this comic is no exception. It contains 5 separate stories: The Legend of Batman, who he is and how he came to be, the Joker, The Giants of Hugo Strange, The Cat, and The Joker Returns. There's only one story that is particularly relevant to today's video, and that is The Giants of Hugo Strange. It's The Cat. In this story, Bruce Wayne and Dick Grayson find themselves on a yacht trip with several other wealthy citizens, and are tasked with protecting a $500,000 necklace from a mysterious burglar called the Cat. It turns out that the Cat is actually a beautiful woman, masquerading as an elderly woman. It's in this first appearance that the sexual tension between Batman and the Cat is established. She's clearly smitten with him, and offers to start a criminal empire with him, acting as the king and queen of crime. Of course, Batman cannot be tempted, no matter how attracted to her he was. The Cat would soon change her name to Catwoman, presumably because it was much more trademarkable, and she would commit crimes in a variety of costumes, including this bizarre proto-furry cat mask, and use her sex appeal to try and tempt Batman over to the side of crime. And that's basically how each Catwoman story would go for the next decade, until the publication of Seduction of the Innocent in 1954, a book that claimed comic books were responsible for the moral degradation of the youth of the day. The ensuing moral panic resulted in some fairly big changes to the comic book industry. No more controversial characters, such as the sultry Catwoman armed with her whip, and gritty crime stories were dropped. Instead, each story would focus on some wacky sci-fi adventure for the better part of 15 years. Catwoman, with her not-so-subtle sexual undertones, generally wasn't used again until after she appeared in the 1966 Adam West starring Batman show. Catwoman made her return to Batman comics in 1967, right in the middle of Batmania. However, despite being one of the most popular villains from the show, or perhaps because of it, Catwoman didn't get any major character development in the years that followed. For some reason, she was given an array of costumes that screamed anything but cat. Take this blue costume with a weird red mask. What exactly was wrong with the black catsuit from the show? Maybe it was considered a bit too BDSM-y? I don't know. During the mini-renaissance of classic Batman villains in the 1970s and 80s, Catwoman was mostly absent. She didn't get her own versions of the Joker's Five-Way Revenge or Half an Evil, stories that redefined classic Batman villains the Joker and Two-Face respectively. The best we got was writer Doug Mensch bringing her back as an anti-hero of sorts. She would try her best to do the right thing and avoid committing crimes, but she would invariably end up on the wrong side of the law. Catwoman's character didn't see any major developments until the seminal Year One storyline in Batman 401 through 407, published in 1987. Writer Frank Miller reimagined Selina Kyle's early days as a Gotham City East End prostitute. Yes, I know Miller has a habit of making his female characters either saints or whores, which is very psychologically revealing of him, but this characterization didn't feel too out of place. His Selina Kyle was a defender of the other working girls, and she took inspiration from the newly emerged Batman to create a costume of her own, which she used to take control of her life. The costume, designed by David Mazzucchelli, was a grey bodysuit complete with cat mask and a tail. It was, at this point anyway, her best costume. Certainly much better than the purple number with the green cape. It's at this point that we come to the creation of Batman the Animated Series. Their version of Selina Kyle is a wealthy socialite / animal rights activist who steals to fund her charitable work. She's almost a Robin Hood type in that she only steals from those who can afford it, and she puts the money to good use working with charitable causes. I believe that the intention was to make her more of a morally grey anti-hero, to show that her stealing was done for a good cause, adding a bit of variety to Batman's rogues gallery. Early designs for the character strongly resembled the Julie Newmar version from the 1966 show, with long dark hair and big cats that she could call to her defence, but this seemingly was scrapped fairly early on. I have previously talked about how the creators of the show were strongly encouraged to synergize with the Tim Burton Batman films. Batman the Animated Series would debut a few short months after Batman Returns released, And while there seemed to be some grumbles about making the Penguin an obese mutant, the influence on Catwoman seemed to be less troublesome for the crew. The primary aesthetic change they made, it seems, is giving Selina Kyle blonde hair to match Michelle Pfeiffer, and ultimately that didn't really change much. When it came to her costume, recreating the black leather with white stitching look from Batman Returns likely wasn't practical for animation, and frankly, that whole BDSM look was probably a bit too extreme for a Saturday morning kids cartoon. So instead they opted for a look inspired by the Year 1 costume, a grey catsuit complete with cat ears, with black gloves and boots, acting as a callback of sorts to the Batman Returns costume perhaps. Frankly, most of Catwoman's early episodes aren't particularly good. The Cat and the Claw Part 1 was the first episode to air in the UK, and I still have very vivid memories of the opening scene with Catwoman scaling the building and her cat Isis stealing the jewellery. Speaking of Isis, another original creation from the animated series, she is by far my favourite addition to the character of Catwoman. It's amazing how expressive, loving and loyal that cat is. And did you know she was voiced by the voice of Scooby-Doo, Frank Welker? Isis is one of my favourite original DCAU creations that found her way to the comics. Yes, other DCAU creations like Harley Quinn, Renee Montoya and the Condiment King are probably more well known. But I love how loyal and affectionate this cat was. When my wife and I got our first pets together, we named one of our cats Isis. While she could be fierce and aggressive at times, she was also loving, affectionate and loyal, very much like her namesake. Anyway, Isis aside, The Cat and the Claw is a fairly standard action-adventure story. The first part at least has some impressive action scenes, but part 2 suffered from worse animation and a generally vague plot. Just what was Red Claw's scheme? What is this cause that she and her men have dedicated their lives to? How were they able to persuade the chairman of a billion-dollar company like Multigon to sign up to her terror campaign? Answers on a postcard, please. Catwoman's next appearance follows on soon after the end of The Cat and the Claw. In Cat Scratch Fever, Catwoman's beloved cat Isis is infected with a man-made virus by the nefarious Roland Daggett. And this is generally a pretty poor episode. The animation, provided once again by ACOM, is slow and plodding, and the story itself is only passable. Having said that, I do enjoy the final scene with Isis. How heartwarming. And the pseudo-swearing from Daggett's henchwoman Jessie.
So kiss off, you dumb cluck!
This episode primarily serves to illustrate the horrors of animal testing and show what a lazy, cruel and heartless person Daggett is. But we already knew that from his earlier appearances in Feet of Clay and Appointment in Crime Alley. It does, however, establish the important plot point that, after her arrest in The Cat and the Claw, Selina Kyle cannot commit any more crimes in the Catwoman costume or she'll be sent to prison for years. This will be important later on. No longer being able to commit crimes leads to Catwoman occasionally helping Batman, and sometimes needing Batman's help, like the time she got turned into a real Catwoman in Tiger. She's willing to be more vicious than Batman, and isn't always able to see the best in other people. Her next main appearance, Catwalk, is probably the best Catwoman episode because we start to see signs of Catwoman's villainous nature poking through. While she has been trying to keep her nose clean, for the most part, she just cannot suppress her true nature. She likens herself to the endangered and extinct animals throughout the episode before exclaiming,
"You know what, Isis? Extinction's for wimps."
All it took for Catwoman to throw her life away was to be angered by the hypocrisy of Veronica Vreeland. The Vreelands were personally responsible for the extinction of several species of animal, and now she comes out talking about her family as protectors of the animal kingdom? Outrageous. Selina gives in to her darker urges and assists the ventriloquist and Scarface with robbing the Vreeland Museum exhibit. In a move that surprises absolutely no one, the ventriloquist and Scarface double-cross Catwoman, leaving her as the patsy for their crime, and this ultimately leads to her downfall. So yeah, that was pretty predictable. But the thing I find really interesting about the later parts of this episode is the scene where Catwoman realises that she's been duped and sets out to get her revenge. Catwoman learns that the ventriloquist and Scarface had stolen a number of stuffed extinct animals whose extinction had outraged her so much earlier in the evening. But when she's caught by Batman and faces a long jail sentence if he takes her in, she doesn't hesitate to abandon her beliefs, throwing one of the stuffed carcasses into the fire, telling Batman to choose between arresting her and preventing that species from disappearing entirely. What a hypocrite! Animal rights were the cause that Catwoman would use to justify her crimes, but you can see even as far back as The Cat and the Claw that she just enjoyed stealing. She always loved taking things that didn't belong to her, and getting away with it scot-free was just the cherry on top. It makes her feel strong, clever and superior. In terms of character development, this scene acts as a course correction for the character. Catwoman visibly abandons her cause of defending animals when she throws the stuffed animal on the fire to escape Batman. It was genuinely surprising to see her abandon her moral code as soon as it became inconvenient for her, underlying the flaws that ultimately define her as a villain. She's a liar. She lies to the police, she lies to Batman, she lies to herself. Catwoman next appears in the episode Batgirl Returns, where she is framed for the theft of a jade cat statue and teams up with Batgirl to prove her innocence. However, this was all a ruse to 1. Find the person that framed her, 2. Punish him, and 3. Take the jade cat statue for herself. I'd argue that it's this episode in which Catwoman is most like her comic book counterpart, and I do really like it, just not quite as much as Catwalk. The thing that's really unique about Catwoman is that she has a clear narrative arc in BTAS. When she's introduced, she is an anonymous cat burglar, stealing from the rich to save needy animals. Then, when she's caught, she's forced to give up the life of crime and instead do some good. Sadly, it doesn't last, and eventually she gives in to her baser nature, indicating that it was the act of stealing that brought her joy, not benevolent acts of charity or kindness. By the end of the series, she has completely accepted this about herself and has no delusions about heroism. She's quite happy lying and deceiving people, even those she genuinely seems to like, such as Batman and Batgirl. When the time came for BTAS to transition over to the new Batman Adventures, and they were no longer forced to reference the Tim Burton movies, Catwoman maintained this characterization, likely because it resembled her comic book counterpart, a thief that stole for fun with dark hair. The change in hairstyle was explained in Batman Gotham Adventures 4. Selina had been dyeing her hair blonde for years, but when she learned that the company that made her hair dye had been testing on cats, well, let's just say she doesn't take the news well. Catwoman made 2 appearances in this show, and in both episodes she showed herself to be playful, mean, affectionate and disloyal. Not entirely unlike a real cat. In You Scratch My Back, Catwoman attempts to manipulate Nightwing into unwittingly helping her recover some of her precious loot by playing into his negative feelings towards Batman. In her second appearance, she continues to use her feminine wiles to manipulate both Batman and the leader of a cat-worshipping cult of murderous thieves, who also happen to have a massive mutant cat in their underground arena, all for her own gratification. Neither of these episodes are particularly great or provide any deeper insight into the psychology of Selina Kyle, but they shine the spotlight on Catwoman's playful side, with some genuinely amusing dialogue.
I don't believe it. You're going to try to steal from them again, aren't you?
I see it more like teaching them a lesson.
So ultimately, the BTAS and TNBA versions of Catwoman are probably among the most authentic to the comics characters this show has produced. It's interesting that while so many villains were quite drastically changed, often for the better, Catwoman was fairly true to her comic book counterpart. The one element that they added to the character, being an animal rights activist, was eventually stripped away, giving us an origin story for the deceitful, deceptive thief she would become.
I said I'd let them take me, but I didn't say how far.